The Best of Daniel Kahneman, 8 Life-Changing Insights. Now, this video is kind of a tribute series I'm doing to Daniel Kahneman. Of course, he is the pioneering psychologist and behavioral economist, a Nobel Prize winner who recently passed away earlier this month. But I think this video is going to be very helpful to you as you think about happiness and quality of life. And what we're going to do is, I say 8 life-changing insights. We're going to start with 3 questions that Kahneman's research answered that I think are incredibly interesting. How happy would you be if you had more money, or would more money make you happier? We're going to talk about does where you live in terms of the weather or the climate make you happier? And then finally, we'll say, what does happiness even mean? And then we'll shift into 5 principles, psychological principles that are absolutely fascinating when we think about how people make decisions, how we process information, and ultimately how we live our lives. So let's get into it. So the first question, like I said, is kind of in this relationship between money and happiness. And it really gets at, would you be happier if you were richer? And of course, Kahneman has a paper on this actually titled, Would You Be Happier If You Were Richer? A Focusing Illusion. And they explain that it's kind of a complicated answer, and that if you were richer, it is likely that you would report or that you would state that you are happier, when in fact you may not actually be that much happier. And so this gets at a distinction here between like kind of life satisfaction, which is when I ask you how happy you are from say 1 to 10, versus like your moment to moment daily experiences. And so the term focusing illusion means that when you focus your attention on something, it has a disproportionate impact on your assessment of your own happiness and quality of life. And so that is exactly what Kahneman and company point out in this paper, is that across various studies, your experienced happiness, so your emotional state, is not all that correlated with your income when you compare it to life satisfaction, which is more correlated. So again, if we were to measure kind of your moment-to-moment experience of your daily life, and then we were to ask you, hey, how happy are you from 1 to 10, right? Your moment-to-moment experience of your daily life doesn't have as much to do with your income as does your sort of self-assessment of where you step back and say, oh, I think I am XYZ. And so what we see is that income doesn't really change that much how we feel, but that when we try to rate ourselves, we use it as a benchmark, and that is where the focusing illusion comes in, is that when we think about how happy am I, we try to kind of focus our attention on some sort of benchmark, and then that informs our assessment. So to answer that question, would you be happier if you were richer? If I were to ask you now and then after you had more money, there's a pretty good chance you will actually report higher levels of life satisfaction or happiness. Yet if I was to kind of track your moment-to-moment experience of happiness versus suffering, or positive versus negative emotions, the changes would probably be minimal. In fact, what they see is that short-term there are some strong emotional changes, but that after several months and years, those changes are pretty much immaterial. So there you have it. But then there's another question I talked about here that I think is quite interesting, that at least in my personal life has been something I've thought about quite a bit, is what is the relationship between like where you live and happiness? In other words, if you have bad weather, are you going to be less happy? And if you have nicer weather, are you going to be happier? So in this study, they looked at 2 groups of students. One group is in the Midwest, but not so nice weather. And then one group in California. And so they look at these 2 groups, and what they found, first of all, is that there was no material difference in happiness between these 2 groups. But where it got a little more interesting, and this relates back to that focusing illusion piece from the money study, is they asked the Midwest students to guess kind of how happy the Californian students would be in a similar set of circumstances, right? So you take this Midwestern student, they say, hey, this student is pretty similar to you, except they go to school in California. So do you think they'll be happier? And what they found is that students in the Midwest thought the students in California would be happier, but in reality, the 2 groups were the same. So I don't know if I mentioned it, but I have a link down below to all of the references for this video. But this paper is titled, Does Living in California Make People Happy? a focusing illusion in judgments of life satisfaction. And so what we find is similar to the money example, that when you draw their focus towards the geographical differences, we tend to think, oh, those people are living in California, and so they must be happier. But in reality, in the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month experience of life, there's no material difference. So when we get at the question of, does bad weather make me happy, or will nicer weather make me happier? Once again, if I were to ask you, like, in that moment and draw your attention to where you live, then it may kind of bias or influence your self-reported happiness level. But if we're looking at the course of your actual life of, like, again, days and weeks and months, it is not going to have a material impact. So kind of useful there as we think about optimizing for happiness. I would argue that this suggests that it's better to optimize for things like relationship density, how close you are to friends and family, potentially job, how much you like your job and what your earnings are at your job, and maybe optimize even for the availability of activities or ways of spending your time that you enjoy, as opposed to just the climate. Okay. Then finally, we said that one of the questions Kahneman answers that I think is quite interesting and useful is, well, what do we even mean by happiness, right? Which is kind of a big question. But it's interesting to make an important distinction, and that is happy in your life versus being happy with your life. So being happy in your life and being happy with your life are actually two fairly different things. And one of the ways that we can think about this is Kahneman offers an example of, just imagine you're going to a concert, and right, it's a really amazing concert and you have a great time, and for several hours you're loving it. And then in the last 2 minutes, the violinist or whatever misses a note and lets out this horrible screeching sound, and it literally even like hurts your ears, and everyone in the audience is like, oh my goodness. You're probably going to remember that whole event as not so good. It's like, oh, that was the night they screwed up and it wasn't good. But interestingly, your experiencing self, right, probably had, let's say, 2 hours of pleasure and then like literally 10 seconds of discomfort. So at times there can be a disconnect between the experience of happiness, that's happiness in your life, and the sort of evaluation of life, or the evaluation of happiness, which is happiness with your life, right? So think about it like this, like you could be having a bad day or even like kind of maybe a bad week, but then I ask you, hey, stepping back and considering your life as a whole, like, how happy are you? Maybe it's like, well, yeah, it's been a rough week, but overall I'm pretty good. But same thing, someone may be, drinking or partying or something, and in that moment, they're like, oh, I feel really, really good. I have this experience of happiness right now. But if you were to ask them to step back and think about their life as a whole, maybe they're not doing so well. And so that is an important distinction, is that our experiencing happiness comes from primarily activities that bring us a state of engagement or interest or positive emotion, as well as spending time with people that we like to be around. Whereas this happiness with life, or this life evaluation, has more to do with this cognitive process of self-evaluation, where you think about like achievement, you think about income, you think about status, you think about all these different things and try to almost kind of rate yourself. And I don't want to necessarily discount either of those. I think that it's important to have some mixture of the two, but it is important to understand that they are fairly different and that they are driven by different things. So again, when we say, well, what do we even mean by happiness? It's really important to have that thought for yourself. Well, what do we mean by happiness? Because there is this idea of a moment-to-moment experience, which Kahneman uses something called the DRM, which is the day reconstruction method. So you can assess it by just thinking back over the course of your day in kind of chapters or series and thinking, how happy was I? What was my feeling like in each of those moments? And when you put all of those moments together, right, you're basically getting happiness in one form. Or you can evaluate it in a more of a life satisfaction model, sometimes called a Cantril ladder, where you're asked to rate your happiness from 1 to 10 based on rungs on a ladder, like how satisfied are you with your life? And in that case, again, it's more of a stepping back and thinking about it intellectually. And so it's not one or the other, but I would argue that when these two things come together, so you have experiences of activities with people that bring you a sense of joy or pleasantness or happiness, as well as some sort of meaning, purpose, and sense of achievement that makes you satisfied when you step back and think about your life as a whole. And when you put those two things together, that's really what we mean when we talk about happiness. Okay, so we've just answered 3 key questions from the work of Daniel Kahneman, which I think have a lot of implications for happiness and quality of life. And now I want to share a few specific psychological principles that Kahneman teaches that, again, connect to happiness, but are also just kind of fascinating in their own right. The first is the peak end rule. So this states that the assessment of an experience is based on a combination of the peak emotional tone and the ending. So now I just kind of highlighted this when I talked about the 2 different types of happiness. But there's some further nuance here. And so basically in one study, they had participants hold their hands in ice water. And so they hold their hands for about a minute, let's say. And then the second group holds their hand in the same ice water for a minute. But then they hold it in for another 30 seconds. But during that 30 seconds, they increase the temperature of the water a few degrees so it feels a little warmer. It turns out the second group, even though they suffered and had more unpleasant experience for 30 seconds longer, I should say, actually reported a more pleasant experience, or maybe I should say a less unpleasant experience. They reported less suffering, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, right? So they suffered for an extra 30 seconds, but because it ended a little better, they remembered it as less bad. And now this has interesting applications, of course, for like life and even policy and all these different things. Actually, think about one study, and they had people get a colonoscopy, of course, a very unpleasant procedure that involves a scope being inserted in one's rear end. And so one group just gets a normal colonoscopy. The second group, they left the scope in there for an extra 3 minutes, but they didn't move it at all. So it was less uncomfortable and less painful, even though it was still in there for 3 minutes. Again, the second group, even though they had an extra 3 minutes of discomfort, thought the experience was less bad. And so it kind of opens up a lot of provocative questions for maybe medical procedures, what's right, what's wrong, right? Like, is it better for someone to actually experience suffering more, but they remember it as less bad? Or would it be better to have them actually experience suffering less, right? Because oftentimes those two don't go together. But at the end of the day, what you want to understand when you're thinking about kind of the cognitive psychology here is that your perception of an experience, how you remember an experience as good or bad, happy or sad, right or wrong, etc., is primarily shaped by the peak emotional state of the experience and how the experience ended. Loss aversion. So loss aversion states that people value losses and gains disproportionately. We're more sensitive to loss, and kind of we suffer and we fear loss to a greater extent than we do enjoy the benefit or the desire of a gain. So in fact, Kahneman and Tversky in this case estimate that losses are psychologically about twice as powerful as gains. And so think about it like this way, say you've got your little stock portfolio or something, and you were to look at it tomorrow morning and say that it increased $10,000. So if you're like me, you'd probably freak out a little bit. Like, this is really amazing. Oh my gosh, this is let's say you have a $5,000 balance and it's now up to $15,000. That's huge. Now think about it this way. If you have that same $5,000 in your investment app and you wake up tomorrow morning and it was at $0, how would you feel? Like, you'd probably really be ready to freak out and like call your bank or call the stock trading commission, SEC, whatever it's called. But actually think about it. The 5,000 to 0 is a $5,000 reduction. The 5,000 to 15,000 is a $10,000 increase. But yet the pain or the anxiety of losing the 5,000 is probably greater than the joy you felt of gaining the 10,000. So this likely has roots in evolutionary psychology. When you think about losing your food or losing some resources would often result in kind of an immediate death, whereas just, gaining some resources might keep you alive for, an extra couple days. And so from a survival standpoint, it often makes sense to prioritize like avoiding danger or harm or loss over just seeking to acquire resources. Of course, there's some trade-off, but again, we want to kind of protect ourselves more than we want to go seeking. And of course, this has many applications for daily life, as we have a natural psychological tendency to prioritize avoiding losses over acquiring gains. And you should know that you will respond more intensely to perceiving something as a loss than you would to perceiving something as a gain. Anchoring. So anchoring is the anchoring effect, states that an individual's judgment or perception is influenced often by arbitrary reference points, also known as anchors. In many cases, again, the important point here when we think about the psychological application is often this anchor point is irrelevant. So for instance, if you're looking at an $800 couch, if that $800 couch is positioned next to a $4,000 couch, it is more likely to be purchased, and you are more likely to perceive that $800 couch as a reasonable price, even though it has nothing to do with the actual fair market value of the couch. It's just you're anchoring it to the $4,000. Interesting application of this study. They asked a group of students whether Gandhi died before or after age 9 or before or after age 140. So I know what you're thinking. It's like, well, obviously neither of those is right? Like we all know he died after he was 9, and we all know he died before he was 140. And so both of those things create a psychological anchor, but we know that the anchors don't make any sense. But when they look at the two groups, those who were asked after the anchor of 9 years old, right? So do you think he died before or after he was 9 years old? And of course, there's like, yeah, after. And they say, okay, well, how old do you think he was? The other group say, was it before or after 140? And you're like, of course it was before he was 140. And then they say, well, how old do you think he was? The group that was first anchored to 9 years old guessed an average age of he died when he was 50. The group that was anchored to 140 guessed an average age of he died when he was 67. So what we see is, again, even when the anchors were totally irrelevant here, they influence our perception. And so broadly speaking, our judgments about prices, right? Like I give the example of the couch and menu pricing. If we see the medium drink, the coffee is $4, and for an extra 10 cents, we can have the big coffee, right? So we anchor when we think about pricing, numbers in general, even like probabilities. So if you were to say, how likely is someone to get struck by lightning? And it just so happens that your great uncle Bob was struck by lightning years ago, you are probably more likely to misjudge the probability of how likely it is to be struck by lightning because you know one person. So again, often in our perception and our decision making, we have these arbitrary and fairly unhelpful cognitive anchors that can interfere with our judgment and our rational decision making. The focusing illusion. I already explained this a couple times, so I won't get too far into it. But again, when our attention is drawn to something, we tend to disproportionately value it, particularly in our assessments of happiness. So I already used the example of the college students and the geography with money, right? And again, a simple example of this is when you ask students, question number 1, how happy are you? Question number 2, how many dates have you been on in the last 2 months? There's almost no correlation. But when you flip it, question number 1, how many dates have you been on in the last 2 months? And question number 2, how happy are you? There is a 0.66 correlation. In other words, that when you ask people first about their dating life subconsciously influences their own assessment of their happiness level. And so in short, whenever we focus on something, it tends to drive how we construct our own assessments of life. And so that may be something that you want to be careful of. Finally, we have adaptation, or the hedonic treadmill. So this is the observation that people tend to adapt to both positive and negative stimuli. Now, importantly, Kahneman did not originate or totally come up with this theory, but he was a significant contributor to it. In other words, both good and bad things wear out. We sort of get used to things. And so this actually got its name from an essay written by Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell, in which they looked at two groups of people. They looked at people who became paralyzed. They had these major accidents that led to disability. And then they looked at people who had won the lottery. And now this study is often miscited as saying that after a few years, the two groups were exactly the same. That is not the case. The lottery group was slightly happier. But what we see is the disability group had this big drop, and then they kind of eventually moved back to nearly what each of their baseline levels were. Conversely, the lottery group had this big uptick, and then they tended to fall back to whatever their baseline levels were. And so this gets this name of the hedonic treadmill, which is almost this idea that we're on this constant treadmill of wanting to get more and wanting to get more pleasure and more joy and more achievement, and that it never quite feels like enough. And this is validated by the psychological literature, saying that as we're experienced to a positive stimuli over and over and over again, it tends to have less of this kind of happiness-inducing effect. And conversely, maybe for the better, when we are exposed to a painful or uncomfortable sensation over and over and over again, we tend to kind of get used to that as well. And so the application here is, I think that Eric Hoffer says it best. I love this quote. You can never get enough of the things that you don't need to make you happy. And so it seems that most of this idea of like pursuing pleasure or status or money or achievement, those things tend to wear out. So we may be better off pursuing other sources of happiness, things like quality relationships, which are shown to be less subject to this, as well as things like maybe exercise, or again, activities, right? So ways of spending your time that bring interest and engagement and enjoyment. That is adaptation. And then finally, I will end this video with what I think is maybe a lesser known share from Daniel Kahneman. He was actually down in the conclusion of a 2006 economics perspective paper on subjective well-being, which is the kind of academic term for happiness. And so Kahneman made several recommendations for society to promote happiness and human flourishing. He basically argued some pretty interesting things. He said that well-being or happiness is something that we should use when we do like cost benefits analysis of like policy, political policy and economic policy. He said we should focus more on relationships, connection, than on materialism if we want to be happier. We should be concerned with social standing more than income, and that we should optimize time allocation to support well-being. So I'll leave you with kind of the words directly from Kahneman. He said, first, subjective measures of well-being would enable welfare analysis in a more direct way that could be a useful complement to traditional welfare analysis. So welfare analysis is that cost-benefit analysis, like I said, of how do you assess policy. Second, currently available results suggest that those interested in maximizing society's welfare should shift their attention from an emphasis on increasing consumption opportunities to an emphasis on increasing social contacts. So that's what I said about going from more, this consumption and materialism to social connectedness being a driver of happiness. Third, a focus on subjective well-being could lead to a shift in emphasis from the importance of income in determining well-being to the importance of his or her rank in society. So our social standing and sense of community often is more important than how much money we make. And then fourth, although life satisfaction is relatively stable and displays adaptation, it can be affected by changes in the allocation of time, and at least in the short run, by changes in circumstances. And so as a society, it's thinking about, can we support people in allocating their time and embodying circumstances that are conducive to well-being? And as individuals, thinking about how can I create circumstances and spend my time in a way that supports my well-being? So there you have it. This has been a comprehensive resource on the work of Daniel Kahneman. We talked about these three key questions about money, weather, and what we even mean by happiness. And then we shared 5 or so of the most important psychological principles from Daniel Kahneman. So I hope you enjoyed this. Here's a video that YouTube suggests you'll like based on my channel. Once again, down below you can find references and resources for all of the studies that I've cited in this video. And that's all for now. So I appreciate you watching. This has been your happiness student, Jackson Kirchis. Join me on this channel for science-based tools to help you be at your best and happiest in work and in life. Take care.